So let's begin the second half of our discussion about human resources approaches, talking about a trend in research on organizations that began to become a pretty significant issue as human resources approaches were emerging. This was in the 1980s mainly, and back during that time, there were some troubling things going on in the American economy. Manufacturing organizations, particularly in the auto industry and in electronics, like companies that made televisions and radios and so forth, stereos, they were really suffering from their competition with Japanese manufacturers. So American companies that made televisions like Magnavox and American car companies like GM, Ford, Chrysler were really not competing very effectively with their Japanese competitors. And so as people were beginning to think more about designing organizations around human resources approaches where human employees are really thought of as resources that should be brought to bear upon improving the organization in a continuous way, more team-based work and so forth. This did not happen as a coincidence. It also happened because of what people were learning about how manufacturing worked in other parts of the world, especially countries like Japan that had been very successful at manufacturing very similar products with higher quality, managing to export them to the United States, and even with tariffs, still managed to sell them at prices that were more competitive than what you could sell things for in the US. So one framework that we can talk about in relation to this is a set of ideas that come from a scholar named Ouchi. Ouchi said, different types of organizations operate differently in different countries. He was beginning to really focus on the idea, something that we already knew at that point, obviously, which was that organizations don't look the same in every culture. There are other national cultures where there are these different ways of thinking about how organizations should be set up. And this became particularly noticeable when they went and looked at Japanese manufacturing organizations. And so Ouchi said, there's a type A organization, which is sort of an American way of operating, and a type J organization, which is a more Japanese style of running organizations. And he decided to assume that these things are relatively culture bound, meaning it's difficult to just create a factory in the United States that is organized around Japanese principles. That turned out to be true, though many companies have definitely tried that and been somewhat successful. But he started making these direct comparisons. So Japanese organizations, as you can see from this chart here, emphasize lifetime employment versus short-term employment that was beginning to become more of a pattern in US organizations. Slow evaluation and promotion processes in Japanese organizations. People were expected to demonstrate their loyalty as employees for a long time before ever being expected to get promoted and have their careers advanced in the same organization. Two really important things that I want to emphasize, and this is kind of a preview for what we start to talk about next in the next chapter when we talk about cultural approaches, is how do they institute control mechanisms in their organizations. Any organization, regardless of culture, has to have some kind of control mechanism to make sure you know what's going on and you reward people for doing the right things and you know about it if the wrong things are going on and can figure out how to respond. In American, more Western style organizations, the control mechanisms were very explicit. Remember Weber and the concept of bureaucracy, rational legal rules. Western organizations are pretty rule bound. And the expectations and the consequences if expectations are not met were really laid out very explicitly, very clearly in a lot of detail. So people worked the way their bosses wanted them to work because they were aware of this in quite a bit of detail. The control processes were pretty explicit. In Japanese organizations, control processes were the opposite. They're actually implicit, actually a lot more subtle. So you did what you were supposed to do, not because of rules that were necessarily written down, but because you understood them in a more subtle, more abstract way that was kind of not clearly spoken. You had a kind of vague sense of what your work group expected of you. And you wanted to work hard in order to please the work group, even though their expectations of you, many of those expectations were not necessarily written down and codified in a set of rules. And so people who studied organizations thought, well, gosh, that's really interesting. And they also noticed that decision-making was handled differently. Not only was the work more often organized around groups, but we also had a system in these Japanese organizations where the decisions that affected these groups, how they were going to do their work, what their work environment looked like, what their goals were supposed to be, what were going to be the consequences if they didn't meet these goals, and so forth. A lot of that decision-making was actually delegated to the work group. So a key difference that they started to notice here is, these employees get to make decisions in a team setting about issues that are directly going to affect their work. Now we have a situation in these Japanese organizations where the decision-making is not separated into management, and management makes the decisions and the workers do the work. Now there's a lot of delegation, a lot of pushing down of decisions down the hierarchy into the lower levels of the organization, and having those decisions be made by people who had to collaborate as a team to get the work done. So you have organizations more often structured around work groups instead of individual work. And you had more of a delegation of decision-making, where groups were making decisions collectively. And they had a lot of stakes in those decisions. They had a lot of reason to try to make good decisions because they would be held accountable for the decisions that they would make. If you set goals and you fail to meet those goals, then the group is responsible for that because they're the ones that set the goals to begin with. And so this really ties into the idea of involving employees more fully in organizations. And this framework helps us understand why human resources approaches want to emphasize communication, not just to make people feel good so that they'll work harder, but because that kind of communication is critical to the development and maintenance of teams. You can't set goals as teams. You can't collaborate as teams. You can't be responsible for your goals. You can't maintain a holistic concern for the work that you're doing together if you don't have good communication. So the really important thing here is when we get to human resources approaches, this is when communication starts to become much more central to what makes organizations successful. It's not just nice to have good communication. It's not just a nice thing to have that might make people feel good and perhaps work harder. It's actually critical to decision-making processes, control systems in organizations, and quality and continuous improvement. So Ouchi comes up with Theory Z, which is a combination of Theory A and Theory J, American way of organizing, Japanese way of organizing. It says, let's combine the best of both of these approaches. Let's allow employees to maintain some independence. And let's allow them to make some decisions. Even as they're independent individuals, let's allow them, expect for them delegate to them decisions that they will make in a group setting and for which they will need to be responsible. This theory Z is basically most similar to what we saw in the previous lecture on Likert System 4. So you have a more team-based approach, you have decisions made more collectively by the people whose work will actually be affected by those decisions, rather than some manager 3 levels ahead of me in some corner office. And more of an emphasis on thinking about employees not as replaceable cogs in the machine. You don't like it here, get out of here, go work for somebody else. We'll just replace you. We'll pour the next person in this mold who will do your job exactly the way we expected for you to do it. No, now there is an emphasis on, let's think about, to the extent that we can, thinking about employees in terms of a long-term employment relationship. That's an idea that is beginning to wither away as we've begun thinking differently about employees, and employees have begun thinking differently about what kinds of relationships they want to have with organizations, whether they want to work for an organization in the long term, whether they even expect to work for the same company for 15, 20 years, 30 years, or whatever. But this was an idea that really began to take shape because why would you want to emphasize long-term employment? Well, if you emphasize long-term employment, now we really can think about these employees as resources, because we're going to be smart about how we hire people, and we're going to treat them well enough and invest in them enough that they will feel like reciprocating, giving back to the organization by maintaining a long-term commitment to the organization. And if they're going to stay around for a long time, maybe we should actually invest in those employees and actually put more resources into training them. Maybe we ought to think about not just training them to do the current jobs, but actually thinking about them from a developmental perspective that says, I'm not just thinking about you and your current job, I'm also thinking about how do we need to give you resources so that you can grow and develop as an employee across your career, so that you will advance within this organization. We'll invest in you. Hey, maybe we'll pay for you to get a master's, an MBA. Maybe we'll pay for you to get a master's degree in organizational communication. And we will think about you as more of a long-term employee who we don't just want to train for the current job, but we want to develop them so that we can later promote them into greater positions of responsibility. When I got my master's degree in organizational communication, I did almost all of it as a full-time employee. The company that I was working for paid for my master's degree. They paid for my tuition. They paid for my photocopies. They paid for my parking fees. They paid for my books. And it wasn't because they thought of that master's degree as, you know, every class session being directly about the current job that I had. They were thinking about me as someone that they wanted to invest in. And they wanted to make sure that I was developing as an employee and becoming more educated so that I could give back even more to the organization. And they would eventually, during this time, promote me. In part, I think, because they saw themselves investing in me that way. So more of an emphasis on long-term employment, training, and development of skills that will benefit the organization in the long run, not just benefit the organization in terms of the job that you currently have. So let's think about content of communication in this approach. What does communication actually look like? Now we have a lot of different types of communication emphasized here. Now it's not just task communication like we had in classical approaches. It's not just mainly social communication or informal communication like we had in human relations approaches. Now we're using communication to produce innovation, continuous improvement. Now we have more of a team-based structure where people are working in groups in addition to communicating with supervisors. And maybe they're working in cross-functional teams where they may be collaborating with people at different ranks and from different divisions of the organization, and kind of a horizontal communication that might be going on. and you have formal and informal communication going on. But still, informal communication continues to be appropriate because that's really the main communication. Even when we're talking about work, it may not be in a terribly formal way when we're working together in groups. So this is what communication in a human resources approach looks like. The chapter talks about Pfeffer's 7 practices of successful organizations. I think this set of ideas is pretty straightforward. If you want to really take a human resources approach, Pfeffer is saying these are the things that you need to do this. Why is he talking about this? Well, a lot of organizations failed to do this effectively. So we'll pick up there next and talk about sort of the what of human resources approaches. How do you actually make these things happen effectively, and what does it have to do with communication?